All right, we're live. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Vervoe webinar, number 6 in our series on the skills shortage. Today, we're going to talk about hiring for potential versus experience. I'm really looking forward to today because I think this is a topic that we think about ourselves quite a lot. And before I start, let's sort of just get ourselves orientated. So 10 a.m. here in Paradise, 8 p.m. on the East Coast, 5 on the West Coast, time for bed as always in Europe. We keep saying that we've got to do something that's convenient for the Europeans, but we haven't got around to it yet. Today I have Moller from Merkle, or the rebrand of Isobar and a number of other companies. Merkle is a global digital design agency with 4,000 employees headquartered in the US. And I asked Annie to sort of tell me in really simple terms, what do you do? What does Merkle do? And Annie said, we make websites, which is the simplest explanation I've ever heard about what a company does. No jargon, so well done. And Annie leads the practice for project delivery in Australia and is responsible for 40 people. And we'll get stuck into what that actually means in a minute. First of all, Annie, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And based on the chat that we had in preparation for this, we've got some really interesting things to discuss. So let's get stuck into it. So first of all, you made a comment to me privately that hiring senior people externally, so bringing people into the organization from outside into senior roles, doesn't always work. Can you explain why you said that?
Yeah, interesting. Get straight into the juicy nuggets there. So I've been at Merkle for almost 8 years now. And, we're always doing a lot of hiring from, juniors all the way up to executive level roles. And one thing I've noticed is that people tend to struggle the most when they get hired into it. Like the more senior the role, probably the harder it is for them to kind of hit the ground running. Particularly because we have a company that's very collaborative. It's very built on relationships, figuring out who to talk to, who can help you to achieve what your goals are. And so kind of coming in and not necessarily having those connections can make it really hard. So it's also something that is in the First 90 Days, which is in a book by HBR. It talks about the phenomenon of hiring externally versus from promoting within. I think there needs to be a balance of both. Like you don't want to just, hire, have the same people coming in. You want to get some diversity of thought. But I think often it is probably easier in many ways and probably better for the staff that you have to be able to promote from within, potentially for someone who, might not have all of the skills that that you would want them to have right now, but use that as an opportunity to coach them and grow them in their career.
Okay, so that makes me think of a few things. And I think, romantically, we all like the idea of promoting from within. And we'll get to that in a minute and what that means and developing people. But I just want to challenge this concept of promoting from within as sort of the default. Doesn't that mean that we're stuck with essentially the people we hired as graduates who, we knew very little about simply because no matter how good a job we do of screening, that they're very early in their careers, and also that the sort of only development and exposure that they've had is in our own factory rather than sort of, it's like someone who grew up in one country and never traveled overseas. Isn't it better to get experience elsewhere?
There are so many things in what you just said. So I think the first thing is what you said, it being the default. So for me, it's definitely not the default. The default is always, okay, what is the right person for this role? Do we have them in the business? What should we do? And where we have at Merkle had that experience is where we have gone externally for a role and we've looked for 6 months to try and fill that role and haven't been able to fill it in the market. in the standard that we kind of, like we're expecting someone to kind of already be up here. And so then we have to ask the question, well, actually, are we overlooking someone? Is there someone internally that could do this role? So I don't think it's necessarily about the default. It's thinking about, is this, is this the right person for the role? And are we overlooking someone because we have preconceived notions of what they can do and who they already are? I think when it comes to, if you do have a really strong graduate program, I mean, obviously there's going to be pros and cons of hiring from within, exactly what you just said, the lack of diversity of thought. But you've also got a lot of the pros of, those people understand the business intimately. They know how to get work done, which I think is probably one of the hardest things about hiring externally, is that people often come into the business and they don't know how to do work inside that environment. But, I definitely am in alignment with you, in agreement with you, that if you are only hiring people, if you're only promoting people from within who have only ever worked at that company, then you definitely will start to lack some sort of diversity of thinking and kind of just different ways of working.
Okay, so let's talk about these people that we're hiring early, we're nurturing, we're developing into potentially leaders, and there's a whole topic around, individual contributor versus leader and all that. We'll get to that in a minute. But let's start from the beginning. So our mindset is, it's not the default necessarily, but we certainly want to bring people into the organization early in their career that, who are not just right for now, they're potentially right for the future.
Mm-hmm.
Does that change how we think about hiring? Do we need to look for something beyond, I can do this job today in people, assuming that we're going to create a path for them? Let's start with that, and then we'll move to sort of to the other aspects of development.
So I think, yes, obviously, if we are going to try to hire for things that are different than just that, then yes, you want to be hiring for, people who are coachable, people who have grit and resilience, people who have, creative ways of thinking, maybe, someone who can look at something from a different perspective, and someone who can take on feedback and action it, and people who have a thirst for knowledge. So when I'm interviewing, I'm actually looking for those traits. Even if I'm looking for a senior person or someone who's a little bit more junior, I'm looking for those traits always, because I think those are the most important traits, because you can mold, you can grow a person into whatever you need in the business or in that role, or anything that's going to be, valuable for them in their career, if they have those particular traits.
So I agree, and particularly on the coachability. I think people who are open to receiving feedback and using that to learn tend to do well and progress in their careers. Law firms like to look for people who will be loyal and who want a career in law. Their biggest fear is that you'll quit to do something else. So they want people who are kind of ambitious, but for that career path, not ambitious for something else. Do you think that's a factor, or do you think it's more the onus is on the company to continue making it interesting and challenging for people to stay? So in other words, let me clarify the question. Do we want to hire people who are kind of like born to work at, Merkle, or born to work in digital design or whatever, or people who are whatever, but the company then has a responsibility to continue to create a path for them?
So one thing that we often talk about at Merkle, especially when someone has resigned and we're, kind of like having some sort of celebration of the time that they've had at Merkle, we always talk about how we're never sad when someone leaves. We're only ever happy for the time that they have basically gifted the company by working at that company. And while I have been at Merkle for 8 years, that's a really, really long time. And that's not very common these days to work somewhere that long. And so I think speaking personally, I don't really care if someone works for us for 2 years or 8 years. I only care that the time that they spend at the company, they actually enjoy working at the company. So I think it's going back to that lawyer scenario. I have so many ex-lawyer friends, hilariously, and there's a reason why they do it is because they get to a point where it's not enjoyable anymore. They have a little bit of their soul sucked out, and those aren't the people that you don't want people like that in the business, right? Because it's sad for everyone.
So you're saying don't worry too much about looking for that. Just hire people that have the traits that you said. Are coachable. Are hungry to learn, curious, etc. And then the company will challenge them. And if that so long as that's suitable and mutually beneficial, they'll stay. And if not, we're happy with that.
Yeah, I think if you hire for someone who has all those skills and then you do nothing with those skills once they have started the company, then obviously they're going to leave. So I think, yes, we definitely have, a bit of a place to play to, help in nurturing people's skills and their career goals. And that's exactly why we've got quite a solid career development framework at Merkle. So every year, people put together a career plan with their managers. They have check-ins regularly on their career plan, what the milestones are, and their careers are nurtured the whole time that they're through Merkle. And I think that's
so. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about career development, and in particular, I think most people, including myself and including you, we've talked about this, have an easy time imagining that people will continue to develop in their craft. I think what people have a harder time imagining is that people will automatically or magically become great leaders. Mm-hmm. And that jump from individual contributor to leader it's a very challenging one. And a lot of people, I think, underestimate and fail to make that jump successfully. And I've seen that in startups. I've seen that in big corporate, in banking, where you've got people who they're very good technically or they're very good at making a lot of money for the organization. And then you give them 12 people to manage. Mm-hmm. Computer says no, disaster. Not always, but sometimes. And there's this kind of assumption or this sort of optimism. We think, this person's great at their job. Let's promote them into a great manager, versus maybe they should be a really respected, senior, highly paid individual mm-hmm. contributor. Not people leadership is not for everyone. It's probably for the minority. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that philosophically. And then second, mm-hmm. practically at Merkle, how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Really interesting point, because I've seen it myself. Not just for me personally when I moved from individual contributor to manager and leader, but also for people that I've seen in my teams. It's really hard, and people do not know how big that jump is going to be until they get there. And we used to have in our career progression framework, we used to have quite a linear framework that went from effectively junior all the way up to manager. And a few years ago, there was a book that was put out by Kim Scott. It's called Radical Candor, where she talks about rock stars and kind of the concept of individual contributors and that not everyone is a manager, which really started to challenge my thinking. And since then, we have redeveloped our career framework. So now we effectively have different paths. So we have, you start off as a junior, and then you can either go down the, kind of the people leadership path, or you can go down the specialist path, is what we call it. And that has really improved, I think, not just the way that we're thinking about hiring and our ability to hire into those roles, but to be honest, also, I think like the quality of life for the people who actually just don't want to manage people, when we acknowledge that is a thing, and we're not going to force them to do something that's potentially going to make them leave.
Okay, interesting. So you've actually separated the pathways and said you can go down this kind of, I don't know if this is the terminology used, but expert kind of path, subject matter expert, or the sort of people leader path. And is it the individual's choice, or does the company have a say in that as well? Is it a discussion?
It's a collaborative discussion. I mean, obviously, when a promotion gets made, that's the company's choice, but we wouldn't put someone into a role that they didn't want to go into. So that would definitely be a discussion as well.
Okay.
And some options, like I can think of someone right now who is trying to figure out if they want to go down a technical leadership role or if they want to go down a solution architecture role. So one is, looking after the team, and one is going to be kind of overseeing technical solutions. And this person has been given the option to try both of those types of roles out for, say, 6 months in one, 6 months here and then 6 months there. And then they get to make a decision at the end of the year which path they want to go down.
Okay. Let's talk about potential for a bit and talk about sort of the trade-off. So I think when we talk about hiring for potential, sometimes people think that means we're hiring someone who can't do anything. And that's actually very far from the truth. We're talking about hiring someone who may not have done the exact same thing, but is clearly wonderfully capable in not just in other ways, but in relevant ways, but maybe hasn't sort of, if you want someone to sort of weld metal, this isn't someone who's been welding metal for 20 years, they've been doing something else that by analogy will help them be good at welding metal, right? So I want to talk about, in potential, what are the things that we're prepared to give up? Like, for example, industry experience, maybe we'll give that up, but we won't give up, I don't know, resilience, or maybe we're prepared to teach coachability, but we won't give up industry experience. And I want to start with you, if it's okay, because, you've been at Merkle 8 years, but, you didn't come in from a vast sort of body of work in project management. You sort of came in with a very different experience. So it'd be great if you could just share your story, and then we can sort of unpack this topic of like, well, what does potential mean, and what's a must-have, and what are the things we're prepared to teach so that people can understand that?
Absolutely. So yeah, for context, for those who are on the webinar today, I was diagnosed with autism this year. I'm 41, so clearly had been a thing for a while, but didn't know that was what was going on. And because of that, because of the way that I think and the struggles that I have, I actually didn't finish high school. I could have gone to university when I was 16, but didn't finish high school, didn't go to university, had no idea what I wanted to do, but was really good at typing, organizing things, and had a massive interest in building websites. Later on when I was around in my 20s, I was dating a developer who would just come home and start talking about all of the things that were going wrong at the agency that he worked at. And we'd talk through it, and I was pretty sure. I was like, I think I can do that job. Like, I don't have the industry experience, but all of my skills are transferable, and I know that I could do this. So it took me quite a few years to be able to get into the industry that I'm in today, basically starting at the bottom and working my way in. And then by the time I joined Merkle, I was already a senior project manager with quite a bit of experience under my belt. But that was kind of a fluke to have found that out. And I suspect that there are probably a lot of people who share that, whether they are neurodivergent themselves or just have skills that they haven't really found their niche. So when I'm looking for people, I am looking for, what sort of transferable skills do you have? What sort of, mindset do you have that could be useful in this company or in this particular role? Given that I've been there myself.
So, okay, I've got so many questions and we can't get through all of them, but let's just start with the individual or candidate side, because I think there might be a few people listening thinking, oh, maybe I should date a developer. Actually, that's probably not the conclusion. But they're probably thinking, well, maybe I can do something that's different, but the world's not necessarily telling me that yet. So what can people do when they look in the mirror to get confidence that, well, I don't have to. In fact, I spoke to someone this week who said, well, I'm pegged, I'm sort of pigeonholed, I've been doing this head of talent acquisition in big corporates for a long time, and do I really, are people really going to see me as head of something else or in a different industry, how am I going to make that change? So what can people do, first of all, to develop that belief, and how should they think about transferable skills? And then after you answer that, we'll switch to the other side, which is what can companies do to identify that?
Oh, how do you build the belief?
Other than dating a developer, because I don't think that's necessarily something we can replicate.
Everybody. I think, for me, when I was going through that process, it was quite a staggered process. So I didn't just suddenly go from being an executive assistant, not knowing what I want to do with my life, and liking websites, to, being the executive director of delivery at a technology company. But I took some small steps where I went contracting for a while, and was doing contracts that were kind of like project administrator, very easily transferable, just to see, is this something that I would want to do? Could I do this? And was lucky enough to find not only a job type that had people who wanted, had lots of open vacancies, but also finding someone who was willing to give me a chance. And I think that's probably the hard one, because you kind of never know who that person's going to be. But, I think through networking, there was no LinkedIn back then, but through things like, LinkedIn or, like agile communities in my instance, or those types of networking situations, you can start to build some sort of relationship with people who might end up giving you a chance, because, I think, or anyone who gets hired, they get hired because the person likes that person for whatever reason, whether it's their skills, their personality, their grit, their resilience, their knowledge, whatever it is. So I think building those personal connections is quite important.
So what can companies do to identify people that have potential, and what's that trade-off that I touched on earlier? Like, what are we prepared to give up? What should we be giving up? Yeah. And what should we not give up on?
Yeah. So I have developed an assessment framework, which is for the staff that we have today, which basically it's quite a complex structure, but includes things like, the resilience, the coachability, leadership potential, kind of just like to shape up what is their potential within the company. And that same framework is something that we think about when we hire people. So it's okay to not have all of those skills. In fact, sometimes you probably can't afford to have someone who has all of those skills. And over the years, we have kind of tinkered with, okay, so how important is it to have industry experience? Maybe let's hire this person without industry experience, but with this other experience and skills, and let's see how that goes. And next time we'll go, okay, well, this person doesn't have this other aspect. Okay, let's hire that and see what how that pans out. So I think we've probably done a little bit of experimentation. We are a technology company.
Let's take an example, because at the beginning of this session, you talked about people coming from the outside not having the relationships. Is that something you could give up and expect people to build over time? So, for example, if it takes someone, 6 months to build those relationships versus someone who already has them, once 6 months have passed, who's going to be ahead? What if the person who didn't have the relationships is going to be ahead after 6 months because they're better in other things? Isn't that a fair trade?
And I think it totally depends, which I know is a really annoying answer. But I think it depends on the context that you're hiring into. So is it that's what's important? Is it that's the gap that you have? So whenever we're hiring, we're assessing not just what is the gap for this role, but how does this role fit into the context of the wider environment, including things like diversity, skills, contacts, personality.
Okay. I'm going to start weaving in a bunch of questions from the audience, and then we'll do a recap. So there's a question around onboarding, particularly in the environment that you've described, where it's collaborative. Collaborative could be interpreted in a number of ways. Could mean cliquey, relationship-driven, network, etc. But that's a currency that's important. Does that mean you onboard people differently if they come from the outside? particularly if you're hiring for potential?
Absolutely. When we onboard people, it's quite immersive, and they will effectively have someone kind of like a coach who will sit in on certain meetings and ceremonies with them to make sure that they know what they need to do in real time, rather than just giving them a book of processes and going, here you go, figure it out.
And how, in a world where a lot of things are done or all things are done remotely, sitting with someone, what does that look like?
I suppose that means sitting on your chair at whatever table you're at in whatever room or sitting.
A lot of meetings, a lot of, but it's accompanying that person. You sort of got a chaperone. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit unreasonable, especially given people are so remote, to just, say, okay, hit day one, off you go. That's hard.
So it's kind of like, it reminds me of when I was a graduate, the buddy system.
We actually do have a buddy system.
Okay. And what about this concept of, you talked about this framework you've got to sort of work out, these are the must-haves, these are the things we're prepared to teach. A recurring theme that we hear is around hiring managers sort of wanting, I need this person to have 19 out of 20 boxes ticked and 10 years experience in every single thing, even things that have only existed for 5 years and all that kind of stuff. So how do you convince people, and you're a hiring manager, and so how do you talk to people and influence people who are kind of really rigid around, forget the potential, like I need people who can hit the ground running now, know everything, can do everything?
Well, I mean, to probably be a little bit flippant, in today's market, you don't really have a choice, because
fair answer.
It's a very, very tight market at the moment. So you kind of have to look a little bit more beyond what you might previously have. But also, I often talk about my own experiences getting into the industry. I've obviously had a very successful career, and I think even just explaining that to my staff who are hiring can help to show them that you don't have to have someone who ticks all the boxes, especially given statistics around women won't even apply for a role unless they feel they meet 100% of the requirements, where a man will apply when they only meet 60. So there's already a whole bunch of biases that are at play just by the fact of who applies.
Okay, I'm gonna wrap. I'm gonna summarize what we've covered, then I'm gonna talk about the next couple of webinars that we're doing, and I want you to tell me if I missed anything. So this is kind of what I took out of today. First of all, have a plan, have an understanding of what do we need, what are we prepared to give up, what's potential, what's experience. It's okay to require people to hit the ground running on certain things. It's also okay to bring people in on potential, but I think having that awareness around what we need for each role, that's kind of the first thing I took. The second thing was be deliberate about how you bring people into the company, how you develop them, the career path that you're offering. And that comes back to this point around, are we hiring for loyalty and people who are going to be here 30 years, or are we okay for people to come in and get a certain experience? And it reminds me of a company that deliberately wants to bring people in for 2 years and then help them leave to start their own business. Maybe that's not for everyone, but that's kind of an interesting concept. And then the third thing is this kind of fork around individual contributor versus leader. And I think most companies sort of accidentally trip into that, whereas there's an opportunity here to be deliberate and say, well, if we are in the business of developing people and prolonging careers inside the company, well, developing and progressing your career does not necessarily have to equal go manage 30 people. It may do, but it may also be become a technical expert in whatever area and include people in that conversation and help them get there. They're kind of the main things I took out of today. Have I missed anything?
That was a really great summary.
Okay. And so firstly, I want to thank you, because I think, in addition to offering your knowledge and experience, you've also shared personally some of your journey, and I took a lot out of that. So thanks, Annie. And heads up for the next 2 webinars. Next week, we're talking about diversity and inclusion. We're talking to Senior Vice President of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at Dallas Regional Chamber. His name's Jared Fitzpatrick. He's based in Dallas, as you'd expect. And we'll be talking about hiring from underrepresented groups. And then the week after, we're talking to Ellie Smith, and I'll see if I can say this with a straight face, VP of People and Culture at Who Gives a Crap. And has there been a better company name than Who Gives a Crap? And they make toilet paper. And we'll be talking about how to retain top performers. So very excited about those two conversations coming up next week and the following. Thank you so much to everyone for joining. Hope you took something out of today. And Annie, thanks very much to you for giving us your knowledge, your time, and your experience.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.